let me just say welcome to all of you around different parts of the world. It's a very international group, as is usual for things sponsored by the ICCE. Of course, take the time to introduce my co-editor and longtime colleague and friend, Daryl Chow. Hey, Daryl.
Hey Scott, and hello to everybody.
I know that where you're at, you're upside down from my time, so it's night there.
Yeah, I was just catching a yawn before we kicked off. I'm glad to put the kids to bed. Everything's good to go from here. Hopefully, my semantics, my words still come out of my mouth straight.
Perfect. And this webinar is the first of two. If you've signed up for the first, you'll be signed up for the second as well. And we'll send an email out about that so that you can log on. And if any additional questions or comments about the materials you've been sent come up, more than willing to address those the next time if we don't get to them this time. We're also recording for those who wrote to us and said, yes, they had signed up. Yes, they were reading the chapters, but they did not have the time available to be with us today. We thought we'd start a bit and just talk about why the field guide, because of course, at the very beginning of the pandemic in May of 2020, Daryl and I, together with Mark Hubble, published the first volume, Better Results, and this was described as a field guide to better results. And there is a bit of a process to this, Daryl, in deciding to write this particular volume.
I think we couldn't squish quite a bit of stuff into better results, isn't it? When we first started with that, and there were a lot of questions, a lot of things that were raised through the consults and trainings that you and I have been doing. So this is sort of kind of like the remnants, the sequel of stuff that we couldn't quite get to, and it was trying to address things that are more in the weeds, a little bit more the nuts and bolts. That's why, actually, I think it was your suggestion. You came up with the term "the field guide," which I like it.
Thanks, Daryl. This is why we work together. Endless compliments towards each other. My experience is much the same, that right now deliberate practice is a hot and sexy topic. The promise is that it will improve your results. Not surprisingly, clinicians are quite interested in this topic until you start to read what it requires. And then it can be really quite challenging. And I think there's also a bit of a promise that all you really have to do is repeat some activity over and over again, which tends to lead clinicians to think, just tell me what that activity is and I'll do it. Clinicians are very willing. But unfortunately, our experience, Daryl, is that that's not really what deliberate practice is about.
But I think on the flip side of that, right, which we can talk a little bit more about today, is that when people speak to perhaps to you, and I know for sure with me, is actually this frustration that a lot of people are actually saying, okay, you're telling us like, where's the evidence for working on this if we're actually going to jump in and to practice on that? So then what are we going to do in the meantime, right?
Hmm.
So this kind of boiling tension, and people want to release to be able to go, I really am wanting to do something about this, so can you just point the way? Which again, the field guide aims to try and do that, because it's figuring out a couple of pieces of the puzzle. I mean, the first one is really the where are you before where you need to go, right? Which is the baseline idea that we talked about in the Better Results book. But then the second piece is then to figure out the leverage point, like what can I actually work on that has got that ripple on effect, the knock on effect for your way of working, because what's right may not be what's right for you to work on, and doesn't mean you should do everything. It's we don't have all the time in the world, and we do need to kind of balance a lot of different things else in our lives. So being able to zoom in on specific stuff is moralizing, it is sustaining to help in your efforts anyway.
And I think the pressure there, given the time limits, is to ask just just tell me something to practice. And then you hear the common things in our field, something about working on a particular method for a particular diagnosis or relationship elements, etc. And if you can just have an exercise to do that, then people are willing. But the problem is, if it's not tied to specific deficits in your performance, then the impact it's likely to have is going to be small to non-existent. So there are sort of those three things. You've mentioned two of them that I could tease out here, Daryl. One is that you do have to establish your baseline performance level. And believe it or not, this is a big roadblock for a lot of us. That means you have to measure your outcome. That doesn't mean you have to use the ORS and SRS, but it does mean you really do need to use some kind of outcome tool that can help you identify both where you're at and where there might be shortcomings in your performance. The measurement part is the easy part. Teasing the results apart and finding one specific thing to work on can be a bit of a challenge. So measurement is the number one thing that clinicians need to start with. And I know, Daryl, this has been a tension for us because clinicians want to get started. They want to jump in. So they will say things to me like, hey, before I have my 60 cases or 40 cases or 30 cases, what can I deliberately practice now?
Yeah.
And I always say what you can deliberately practice is getting good, reliable data, which makes most practitioners yawn very broadly.
That's right. I even see Bogdan laughing when you said that too, because I think there's a bit of resonance with that comment.
But it really does start there. So measuring your outcomes, and nowadays, even though we provided a lot of formulas for doing this in the Better Results volume, using some kind of sophisticated outcome management system is probably what you're going to need to do if you really want to have the kind of data at your fingertips that you can begin to tease apart something to improve for you. The second part is to actually know what it is you do. If you've been in practice for any length of time, then most of what you do has become automatic. So that means needing to map your performance. And we did change something in the publication between Better Results and the field guide based on feedback from the folks that had read Better Results. And that was, we provided much more detail about how to complete your blueprint or map of your therapy performance. At the same time, Daryl, I will say the blueprint is another big wall.
Yeah, I mean,
Process.
it really looks like you and I are in a business of building roadblocks for people, like we created all these sort of obstacles to that. No, you got to get through this before that. And then honestly, it could be quite discouraging, but here we're really focusing on the long game. We're trying to cast our eyes something that's really far and wide, and individualized too. So that particular roadblock that you mentioned about developing a blueprint, that's really important. I mean, in brief, it simply just means if you were to talk to somebody who's naive about your work, how are you going to explain what you do, right? Whether it's visually, whether you're going to say it verbally, or even you're going to say it like algorithmically, even, or like bullet point kind of way. But in a sense, it's transferring from what you do intuitively into something that's representative that could be passed on to somebody. And it's going to be helpful because it gives you a sort of mental map of where you are currently, so that when you start to build or adjust, modify, edit pieces, you know what you're changing, what you're playing around with.
And we hope that the information in the field guide helps a bit with this. Initially, we talked about simply creating a series of if-then propositions. Well, if the client does this, I do that. We've since added Goldfried's levels of abstraction so that we don't just have a disembodied set of techniques that depend on contextual circumstances, but rather are organized in some logical way that describe the flow of your work from beginning to end. And so one hint that I think both Daryl and I have noticed in doing consulting with individual practitioners around DP is you can do some of this by sitting and reflecting on your work. Another part of this has to be done by perhaps recording a session, maybe one in the beginning, maybe one in the middle, maybe one at the end, and mapping that session, asking, why did I do this at this moment? And expect to find this a struggle, because as you were saying, Daryl, much of this has left the land of conscious or intentional behavior into the land of automaticity. So we're having to raise consciousness to really think about what's the meaning in the moment, what are the contextual pressures that led to this choice, and what's the larger overall arc of clinical thinking that makes that choice at a particular given point in time in the work.
And I want to emphasize what you just brought up, Scott, about recording the session, because to that is pretty critical from a microscopic level. It's the same that if you are a sports person or you're a musician, you can't just talk about it. You have to get into the thick of it. You have to get into the music of it, right? So hearing it gives you the flavor, gives you the tonality, the feel of how the session actually goes. So in short, I think being able to listen in on the micro level and then pairing that with the measures, and then if you got aggregated data layered on top of that, this gives you a little bit more of a 3D perspective.
And Daryl, I want to highlight in what you're saying here the difference between random errors and non-random errors. This is a point that we made in the original book, Better Results. The key here is that you're going to have to make, well, in fact, we said about 2,000 decisions in a given session about what you say, what you do, what you don't say, what you do say. And you're going to make many random errors, things that miss, but they are not part of a bigger pattern that may limit your impact over time. And so by having these three levels that Daryl is talking about, you're much better able to identify non-random errors. Not random errors can be solved by improving our responsiveness using the SRS, periods of reflection, the ORS, in the moment. Non-random errors requires that we step back and from a distance see recurring patterns of problematic behavior. And I just add one other thing, coming back to something else you said as well, and that is focusing on the long term. That's what deliberate practice is about. Purposeful practice, hang with me here, is about repeating something until you are proficient or reach a certain criterion level of competence at that particular strategy. The nice thing about purposeful practice is you feel good very quickly. You feel like you've accomplished something quickly. You got it. You did it. That's what the entire continuing education pyramid is all about, making you feel good in the moment because you master a particular strategy. Deliberate practice is about reaching for a performance objective that's just beyond your current ability, which means the long term is key. And I think that Daryl went straight to one of the questions that Jonathan, I think it was John Sky, asked, which was, how do you keep this going over the long run? We do have a section in both books about developing a habit and strategies for maintaining DP over time.
Yeah. I don't know what you think about this, Scott, but I would be really curious about how many people actually did the TDPA. The reason I'm saying this is because when this was, I don't know when this was created, like 2014 or 15 now, when we first started doing this, Scott, I remember it was purely selfish reasons. I was just trying to figure out, like, what the heck do I pay attention to? So I'm like, look, how do I actually tear this apart and build this back into a coherent set of narrative again? And you know, it all started from there. And then the research that you did leading to that, you know, I'm really wondering about how people take it, because the consistent comment that we get in workshops and consults, as well as and the DP online stuff that you and I do, and like many people say this is actually quite an overwhelming thing. One of the questions was, how much do I write in the notes? How much do I elaborate on those things as well? Because how do I put all that down? So I don't know what you think, Scott, but I would love to hear from people, whether on the chat or thumbs up something in Zoom about have they done it? Have they gone through the TVPA? And if so, what was it like? And if not, what was some of the hesitancy around that too?
So I will say, Daryl, that we did ask that in the registration questionnaire, and a preponderance of people said they had not filled it out.
All
There
right.
were a few people that asked very pointed, very specific questions, like how does, one of the questions was suggestions for 3, capital
Mm.
A, point 2.
Yeah.
There were a few questions that were that specific, but people mostly said they had not done it.
Okay. Okay.
Which,
So,
if we're feedback informed, either means the TDPA is shit, or the other interpretation is that people they can't just get beyond. I mean, it's just a huge task.
that's right. It reminds me of like when I was in the military service in Singapore. They used to make us run this standard obstacle course, and they put this like 3 meter wall and expect you to jump with 7 to 10 kg worth of gear, and then smash. You just hit the wall, and just can't get past and can't get past. And I don't know whether is that a function of how it's designed, something we could do, or maybe we should hear from some of you your thoughts around
Hmm.
this inquiry.
Perfect. And Daryl, let me
Hmm.
just lift this, because we talked
Yeah.
about 3 things, 3 pieces that form the backbone of this way we're talking about deliberate practice. And then I'd love to hear as well. The first one is measurement. Whatever we have to do to get you to measure your outcomes, that is part of deliberate practice. Anybody who says you don't need to measure your outcomes, or they can figure out what you need to learn, is the status quo. The second part is the blueprint or map. In order to know what to change, we have to know where your deficits are, and then we have to find those deficits in the way you conceptualize your work. And the third part now is the TDPA. That's the third piece of this backbone, and that allows us to tap factors that have leverage on outcomes.
And people are really chiming on in the chat. Thank you very much. Bolton's asking about the supervisor version 2. Yep, we should get that formatted to be released to you guys for the supervisor's version. It's basically the same thing, just worded for a supervisor, really. Daniel has mentioned about he likes how we keep updating it. It's more like we can't make up our minds, and it's just constant tweaks and adjustment. And I mean, one of the other things that we might adjust later on, maybe version 10 or something, but the end page about all these things that get boiled down to stretch goals, that last page may require some tweeting as we go. He goes on to say it's a big task. Mary Hosborough says that not done it yet. Yep, I like that. Took me a long time. Will says took a long time sitting to fill out. No doubt input enough detail. Yeah. Martha says I read through it and completed prelim version. The items I noticed have resulted in more contemplation of areas that will need more attention. I love that comment. And Heidi says filled out previously but haven't updated it. Right. Great. Okay.
One way to think about the TDPA is that all 3 of these pieces that we've talked about, the measurement, the blueprint or map, and the TDPA, they're all pointing at something. No one will provide you with a complete picture. So all of these are hinting at where you might be able to work. Since therapist self-assessment doesn't seem to be particularly reliable in terms of continuing education choices, the TDPA complete alone, in my opinion, is insufficient.
Yeah.
It has to be backed up by data. And it can always be really good to have some type of coach that can also help you sort through your data. And I wanted to give one example of that, if that's okay with you, Daryl.
I'll go.
So Michael Harloff, if you haven't seen his interview, it's available on my blog. And Michael he was very studious, very data driven, gathered sufficient data, and organized his clients by effect size. So he started with the data. He isolated the 10 least effective therapies that he had done, and he began completing the TDPA and a map. Before he did that, he noticed that his outcomes were poor in one particular area, or I should say with one particular group, and that is men. And I can remember the conversation we had about this because he said, what can I read to learn how to do better clinical work with men? And I thought, I think we need to get a finer grained picture here. So what is it about these men? Because he had clients who were men who had perfectly fine outcomes. It's just a preponderance of the negative results were with men. We begin to look more closely. He goes back and he does a fair bit of work reviewing all of his case notes. Listen to the process here. Daryl would describe this as a learning project. He notices an area of poor outcomes. He starts to develop a learning project around looking at his data and looking at his progress notes. Turns out that most of the poorest outcomes among men were with men who were angry. Now, that doesn't answer the question here about what do we do with this, but Michael's question was, should I take a workshop on learning to work with angry men? I said, let's just hold off on that for a second and do the TDPA. So now the TDPA comes in and he starts to complete it. And none of the items in section 3 on relationship really stand out as difficult. Rather, what really stands out as problematic and an area of something that he struggles to do is in model and technique. And it turns out that he has a hard time being direct. As long as he's accepting, loving, empathic, genuine, all of those good counseling basic skills, clients get well. But when clients were asking for direct counsel and advice, should I stay or should I go in my relationship? Michael tended to fall back on reflection, empathy, and did not give direct advice, which resulted in these men feeling angry, which led to poor outcomes. And so his deliberate practice efforts in part 5 of the TDPA began to take shape in terms of knowing when he needed to be direct with his clients.
That's a great example. And somebody said this to me while we were working and sort of banging our heads on that wall. We were doing this thing, as you kind of mentioned, right? We're trying to solve for patterns. We're trying to not just solve for specifics, which is, you said it was more like random issues. We're trying to look for non-random issues. And he kept looking at his data set. He has got quite a sizable amount of, like, more than 100 of closed cases already. He said, I just can't find any kind of clear patterns that's springing out. But as we went back and forth, he had this like literally a light bulb moment in our conversation. He said, oh my goodness. His words were like, I've been looking at the wrong place. I said, what do you mean? Do you find some kind of new pattern within your clients? He said, no. He said, the thing that I've been looking at was I've been trying to see the patterns on my clients. Instead, I should be looking at the way I respond to my clients, which is exactly what you said in your example, Scott, with Michael, how I relate. Because if we see this as a relational enterprise, it's not just a kind of one-way sort of thing. It's interactional pattern. So he was trying to see what happens to him when he's faced with these bunch of clients with less successful outcomes. And that was the catalyst for him to go a little bit further. And that's what we hope the TDPA would do as well, to help us look, within, but also between the relations of two persons. But I want to add one other piece on top of that, if it doesn't complicate things further, Scott. I think this is important. I think that many people, especially for you guys, and we're really thankful for your support and your keen interest for this new book, but many people who are really on fire about this, they strike me as really hardworking by default, very conscientious. And I remember when I first started measuring, I gotta admit, like in 2004, 2005, the one thing I was really obsessed with, quietly obsessed with, I didn't dare to tell anybody, was that I worried that I suck, right? And I was so worried that I suck. All I want to do is to figure out that if I was performing, like if I was okay. But once I knew that, the relief was short lived because it still feel like nagging, and that's because I was quite, maybe it's me, the Singaporean in me. I was very focused about performing and doing well, and that kind of landscape really did not have an opening for real deep learning. And I think that distinction is not just a semantic issue of performing and learning. You know, we all would say, yeah, we value learning and all that, but learning requires a sort of openness. And even though Scott and I are talking about how to help you develop as a clinician, it's not really about you. Because if you start to focus too much, like if you get professionals who try to improve in their public speaking, the worst thing you could do is, and you might have heard this before, practice in front of a mirror, right? I personally think that's ridiculous because once you're focused on a mirror, just like a Zoom call, if your self view is on and if your self view is like inflated, all you could be looking at is yourself, right? And the strange thing about what we're trying to do is to get you to a space where you could be grounded and you could have specifics that you could work on. And I think that's not for all of us, but for some of us, we do need to kind of step out of that zone of like, oh, am I performing or not, which I was clearly in for a long time.
Daryl, I wanted to return to one other thing and go back to this idea about keep focus on the long run as opposed to the short run. So if you're focused on what you're learning as opposed to improved performance in the short term, I think you'll stick with this for a little bit longer. There'll be a sense of wonder and awe and enthusiasm. And this for me ties to a question that I believe Tom had asked in his initial registration. And I want to use this as an example of what we've just been talking about. He asks how to establish goal consensus in first and subsequent sessions, how to help clients with no clear goal. And Tom wasn't the only one who asked this particular question. So from a deliberate practice perspective, I'll talk about this, and then briefly from the field's perspective. From a deliberate practice perspective, the answer to the question is, we don't care. We don't care how you do it. We just want to know, did you do it? Which means we have to ask the client, did you feel it? If one client doesn't feel it, that does not a pattern make. It means you screwed up that one time with that particular client, nothing to learn. You'll be tempted to try to learn something. It's a random event. But if you notice that your client's ratings on goal consensus are consistently over time low, then this may indicate that you have an issue with that in your way of doing it, which now leads to the map. Now we have to figure out how you think about reaching goal consensus. Then if you find out that your problem with goal consensus is structure, you don't leave enough time in the first visit, or you are overly structured and rigid in your approach, like what's the smallest sign? When will you have achieved it? How will others notice? That may also be a problem for you with your clients in the long run. This is what makes, I think, DP different from and more difficult to do than purposeful practice. Because in purposeful practice, all I say is, here are 5 useful questions to establish goals. Ask them. And then once you ask them, I can tick off on a box, well, you did it, and therefore you're competent in that particular format, if that makes sense. I hope I'm getting this particular question, Tom.
Yeah.
And the way we would work is we would first map how you do that, and then we might begin to have you explore other ways. Daryl, anything else on that?
I like your comment though. There's just so many ways, and the distinction that you kind of made, I want to underscore about the distinction about purposeful practice, because purposeful practice prescribes that there are key 5, 10 ways of doing things. But you know what? Like, uh, all you have to do is just sit down with a colleague and just go, let's brainstorm, like, let's push ourselves to give all the good or bad ideas of how to develop a goal consensus. And you could come up with 20, 30 ideas, just going back and forth, doing that a little bit. But the key is still figuring out how you languaging that. Does it fit with your voicing? And is that even the issue that's being presented with the way you're working with clients? Or like what you mentioned about the timing, are you too rigid about that? You always think about smart goals, everything has to be so specific. Or is it issue of structure? You don't allow enough scaffolding to give a rough guide of when you actually start to develop an effective focus of where to go. So there's just so many different ways, and it really depends on where you are at before where you need to grow.
Perfect. So we're trying to fit this to your biology, your background, your upbringing, most importantly, the cultural context in which you're working, which is also going to flavor the way you have conversations about certain topics, or operationalize certain therapeutic principles in your clinical work, which makes this way of thinking about deliberate practice much less structured in a way, but also much more likely for you to be able to carry on once you're out of earshot of your coach. And it's also why I think something you did, Daryl, that is a really important step in this process. Instead of teaching people specific technical ways of doing things, we've been moving towards operationalizing principles. And in this was one thing that we asked our contributors to the field guide to do, and I will tell you, they struggled. They struggled to get the in between the research review, which is the first part of the chapter, and here's how you do it, which is the last part of the chapter, having them state a clear set of evidence-based principles to inform behavior that therapists could operationalize given who they were in myriad different ways. That's the beauty of this way of thinking. And if we can ever get this damn study published, Daryl, it will be the first under review right now in Frontiers on Psychology. It'll really be the first to adopt this way of thinking about how to train therapists.
Mm. Yeah, and just to elaborate, when you say to model, that means we're not teaching people what to say specifically. I mean, that there are many ways to say the same thing. I mean, the language is praxis, and language really matters. Just for example, like Tom's question about goals. Goals conjure up a sort of framework in our heads, right? But if we talk about direction, it may mean roughly the same thing, but may mean totally different thing for another person, another client too. I want to read out loud. I want to take the chance to read out loud Jonathan's question because I'm still trying to digest that. So maybe Scott, you can help out with this.
Hmm.
Jonathan asks, is purposeful practice a term for the DP they discuss generally in the literature, which is growing around specific DP such as DP for CBT? Do you want to comment?
Me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, I would love to comment, and I will warn you that I have a very strong bias about this, which Daryl is aware of. When you put those words together, like DP for CBT, DP for EFT, this it makes no sense to me, because if you had a deficit in being able to deal with people's cognitive orientation or their behaviors, maybe you could do DP for CBT. But there is no such thing, in my estimation, as DP for a particular model. It makes no sense to me. What that is purposeful practice, which is an important part, an important type of practice. It's how most of us learn to drive a car, ride a bike, and play a piano. But we're not talking about achieving a certain basic level of skills or proficiency. We're talking about pushing beyond that to something else. So for me, there's a general confusion in the literature so far, a source of contention and debate around this idea that DP for specific models. It's a very popular idea, by the way. And it's the exact same idea our field has had for the last 50 years. Learn this method, do it well, and your outcomes will be better. I defy you to show me a single study that shows that to be true. You're just not going to find that. So, in fact, most studies of particular models use the most experienced therapists. Think about this. And they compare experienced therapists doing this approach to experienced therapists doing this approach. That's quite different from taking novices and training them up to be proficient in a particular model and then testing their outcomes and seeing if they're any better. In the literature, one study that did that. We mentioned that study in the Better Results volume. It was a study in the UK that spent a year and hundreds of hours. They measured people's outcomes before they were trained in, actually it was CBT, before they were trained in CBT. They trained them for an entire year, supervision, feedback, video review, very intensive. And then they measured their outcomes after reviewers who were coding their videotapes could no longer tell the difference from experts doing CBT. What did they find? No difference in outcome. So if you want to become proficient at something, purposeful practice is exactly the way to do that. The problem with purposeful practice is that you will end up wanting something more, because you as a clinician will start to notice it seemed to work here, but not there, with this person, but not that one under these circumstances, but not these others. That's where DP steps in and offers promise.
I have 2 points related to what you just said, Scott. I think one is that this is just my view. I feel that when people think about the need for modalities to hold on to, I think really what people are saying underneath that statement is they need some form of structure. And I would argue that you could develop a sense of dynamic structure of the way you run your therapy hour without just being confined to two models of thinking. That's one point. The second point is that for me, it's just commonsensical to not start with a limitation of training at a particular area. For example, if I want to be a musician and I want to get good at songwriting, and I really care about the craft, I'm not just going to go, let's good at writing pop songs and just do pop songs and just get this good at playing jazz, just do jazz. I mean, that kind of confinement is number one, purely by the labels of genres that we give, right? And that kind of labeling just may allow us some level of a handle at first. I think when you start off, it may be good, but I don't see a need to confine. Like I don't see need to be things need to be explained within a particular treatment modality of thinking. It could be the theory could unfold in the conversation with the person, and you may be informed by a couple as opposed to going like, yeah, I have to adhere to this particular work. And I can't stress enough how this actually can plague people, because again, it's that performance thing. So if somebody was training in CBT or EFTC or some kind of schema-based training, there's often some kind of certification process, like things that they have to do, and they got to video record, they got to demonstrate certain things. And if they don't, they get this feeling of like they're not performing, they're not doing well, and they'll be judged, and they may not get the certification on that. And I mean, I can understand the want to do that and to be proficient on that, but somehow or other, that kind of schooling, I think we need to loosen that up a little bit.
I'm looking here at the clock, and we have just about 10 minutes left, and you and I have been talking, and Daryl and I could, I promise, do this for hours and hours. So maybe it would be time to just open up and see if there are any other concerns or issues, feedback you have about the volumes, the material that you've read so far, anything at all.
In my clinic, we bring in 4 to 6 early career therapists each year to train them. I'm just so grateful to you guys for giving us this material and structure to help them. It's wonderful.
Wow, Paul. Thanks. One thing I've noticed, which I have found really rewarding of late, as a young graduate student trying to learn how to do therapy, I often felt on the outside of my classmates, and I'll tell you why. It seemed like they got this stuff way better than I did. And so for years, secretly, I thought, I'm therapeutically inept. I don't get this. I can't figure this out. As we begin talking about deliberate practice, I've found many more students willing to share that. In fact, they feel lost a lot of the time. And I found many experienced therapists saying there are long moments where I'm thinking, what in the hell is going on? And what am I doing? And to me, that is what deliberate practice helps with, hopefully not overwhelming us with a feeling of not knowing, but starting the learning process by not having to do what Darrell was saying, perform to some standard that is artificial and not really related to outcomes.
I have a comment and a question. You know, I think different from other areas of deliberate practice, we do not have good simulators. You know, when you try to play an airplane, there are good simulators that you know, parallel what's happening on board. We do not have these simulators, and I'm interested in maybe group happenings or other sorts of things that can, when we do not have the clients that is angry often enough.
I'll say one thing, Bogdan, and really thanks for this particular question. Because I have both positive and negative reactions to what you're asking for. Some of you know Wendy Amy. She is one of our signal shrinks that was like a top performer. And I don't think she would be upset if I shared that at the height of her excellence, she changed jobs. And suddenly she found her superior results were much more average, and she had a lot more negative results. To me, the answer to your question lies there. You start to learn within a context with certain people and circumstances how to make this work really well. And she was excellent. The process she used to do that intuitively was deliberate practice. But once the contextual variables started to shift, those rules didn't apply anymore. The things that she'd mastered so well weren't there. So super shrinkdom is not something inside you. It's not static.
Wow.
It's contextual, and it's
Great
learning
point.
to operate really well within a given context, as opposed to saying, as I understand your question, maybe we need to develop a simulator for working with angry clients. Number one, if that pressure, contextual pressure, isn't present on your client caseload, you will very quickly forget because it's not relevant. So we've got to, that's why measurement is so important. We've got to figure out where the deficits are for you at this time in this context with these people and circumstances, and then feedback from there.
I just love how you stress the point about the contextual factor, because it's not like there is a absolute super shrink somewhere, you know, like wherever you go you'll be able to transpose, because it's usually very contextual specific, environment specific to the people that you're serving. One thing I do say to teams when I work with them is, if they start to lay and build all these pieces that we've talked about, use all these walls to build a home and to construct something that's used for them, one other piece I would suggest for them is to develop native labs. What I mean by native labs is just construct things of a deep learning environment where people could learn specifically in, let's just say, if it's a student counseling center or if it's a family service center, you know, things that there's a preponderance of cases that comes up with this sort of struggles, like somebody who is brought in under the behest of a parent, or somebody dealing with OCD kind of features. If this is in the clinic, you know, develop that sort of interactional difficulties that they normally would see and create that kind of labs around that. And if you start to get stuck even with scenarios, I mean, for those of you who may not know, ChatGDP, a sort of AI system bot, you could just write in a message to ChatGDP and say, give me a scenario about this that's related to my agency, and flesh that out, and they will come out with, you want 10 variations of that, they'll spit out 10 variations of that, and you could use that as a springboard. But the issue, I think, it's not the lack of simulation, actually, because I think in the environment of simulation, it is just a stimulus. The key is still what Scott just said previously, is that how people are learning. Are they learning via just trying to perform, i.e. they're not really learning then, or are they learning just to say what's the right things for therapists to say, like, oh, it sounds like you're feeling this way, you know, a very therapist way of speaking? Or are they learning mental representations, principles to hold in their head so that they can hook and to be able to use that as a kind of an anchor point in their mind, which is much more difficult, because you do need an environment where it's not just performance feedback, which is what's the score, high, low, that's performance feedback. You need an environment of learning feedback, which is like, okay, where is Daryl's edge? What does he need to learn? If I say this to him, will he be able to get it? You know, we have to think about that in a very ideographic, individualized manner. So I think that the stimulus are great. In fact, they're easily found and easily created. But in summary, I think we need to think about how then we can create learning systems rather than just performing systems.
Everybody, our hour, as we promised, has gone by very quickly, and we, Daryl and I, want to support you in your DP efforts. We have another iteration of the DP course coming up. This is our asynchronous course, and if you haven't signed up for that course, you can. And if you type in Field Guide 33, I'm putting it in the chat, no slash, just Field Guide 33 at betterresultsbook.com. You can get the course for 33% off. If there's some way that we can help and support you in your efforts and continued reading of the book, please send us an email.
And I just want to take a moment to say thank you for people who are joining us from all over the world, different time zones, and the fact that we could be in this blip moment in time together. That's great.